Welcome, everybody. We're going to start in a minute. Ken is going to be doing the formal introduction of Dr. Boyd. I'm Dr. Jian Ho, Professor of Healthcare Ethics and Philosophy at MCPHS, and I'm also the chair of the Center for Health Humanities. And I'm super excited about today's talk. It could not be more timely as a topic. And I also want to let you know that during the course of this year, like in previous years, we are going to have our annual speaker series, and we have some great speakers lined up. And to learn more about it, please go to our website for the Center for Health Humanities at MCPHS, and it will list all of our future events. I would also like to make a quick announcement that MCPHS has just launched our first ever Bachelor's of Arts degree. It is a degree in Health Humanities, and this is primarily for our students. If you are interested in pursuing a study of healthcare, health, and medicine from a humanistic point of view, now you can. And not only will you learn a ton, it is also compatible with lots of our professional tracks. For example, you can be a health humanities major and be a pre-med. I think that's a very attractive combination. And our illustrious colleague, Dr. Carol Ann Farkas, will be the director of the program. So if you have any questions, reach out to her. If you have friends who are having some thoughts about switching majors, consider health humanities. I think it's going to be a real fun major to pursue at MCPHS. So with that said, I want to hand the baton over to Dr. Richmond and let him do the formal introduction. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jane Boyd. And we tried to get Jane last year, but she was busy preparing what turned out to be a very timely exhibit for the Mütter Museum. And so now that that's launched, she's able to join us for this extremely relevant look back. We know that we can learn from history about ourselves. You know, sometimes people say that an educated person is someone who knows something about everything and everything about something. By that measure, I would say that Dr. Boyd is educated several times over. She is a trained art historian and a museum professional who's done what we call deep dives into a lot of very interesting and detailed and important and such a wide variety of different topics. For some of America's most respected and beloved institutions, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Benjamin Franklin's own American Philosophical Society, and for the amazing Mütter Museum. And her work there obviously forms the basis of her talk for today. So I'm going to say something about how the session will run, but I hope that you are all ready, as they say at the Mütter Museum, to be disturbingly informed. What we'll do is I've set things up so that everyone will need to be muted. If you have questions and comments, and I hope that you'll have lots, you can enter them into the chat. The chat will come to me only, and that way I'll take notes and I'll be able to relay them to Dr. Boyd at the end of her presentation. If we have plenty of time, we might, depending on how things go, if we have time after we address the questions and comments sent through the chat, then we may open it up and allow everyone to unmute, but we'll see how it goes. You can send your questions and comments at any time because it won't pop up on everybody's screen, so it won't be disruptive. So when you have an idea, shoot it out to me, and that'll be fantastic. I'm so glad that we have the support of the provost to invite Dr. Boyd and run our programs, and I'm also so happy that we can reach out. Usually we have these on the Boston campus, but now that they're online, we can reach out to all of our campuses, and we've had such a nice response and lots of people coming in today. We have at least one visitor from abroad and people from around, not quite around the world, but lots of places. So Now, I'll hand it over to Dr. Boyd, and we can all learn about how spit spreads death.
Well, thank you so much, Deanne and Ken, for that nice introduction. And I am very happy to be here, very honored to be here and speaking to you today as your neighbor, East Coast neighbor from down south. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen and start my presentation. I want to preface my talk by saying that I am not speaking about this project as an official representative of the Mütter Museum or of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, but simply as a participant in this project along with many, many other people. So the Mütter Museum is part of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, which is the oldest professional medical organization in the country. And the museum is a remarkable collection of anatomical and pathological specimens that were formerly used for medical teaching and are now open to the general public. The mission of the college as a whole is to advance the cause of health while upholding the ideals and heritage of medicine. Now, to give another disclaimer, I'm not a medical professional. I'm a public historian and a museum professional. We worked with a historical epidemiologist on this project and consulted virologists and public health experts, but my main focus is storytelling and translating scientific knowledge for a general audience. So this is not really a scientific or medical talk. So pandemics are obviously a timely topic. The threat of the next big infectious disease pandemic has been hanging over our heads for quite some time. New diseases have been emerging as dangers in recent years, like Ebola, Zika, and old diseases resurging, like measles. These magazine covers are from 2017, but stories like these have been common in recent years. And of course, when the coronavirus pandemic hit, it really did feel like the world stopped, as these covers of Time magazine from March show. We were not prepared for this pandemic, for a disease that was this virulent and this deadly and had such wide-ranging effects all over the world. And we have just passed some grim milestones: 200,000 dead in the United States, 1 million dead worldwide. This story is just from Monday. So what can we learn by going back 100 years ago to find out how people coped with another deadly pandemic? So here is a brief overview of the pandemic before I delve into what happened in Philadelphia. As we've known, because there have been so many stories on it, because of the parallels with the coronavirus, it was one of the most deadly disease outbreaks in world history. And it was called the Spanish flu not because it came from Spain, but because the disease was covered there in the press more thoroughly than in other countries, since Spain was neutral in World War I and didn't have censorship of the press, as other countries did. So the global estimates of deaths range from 25 to 50 to 100 million, perhaps as many as 100 million. And in the United States, a quarter of the population was infected and about 675,000 people died. And these are astonishing figures, truly off the charts, as you can see from this peak here. And this is at a time when infectious disease deaths were declining because of advances in medical knowledge and public health practice. You can see the pink line there is going down until that massive peak in 1918. It was a true pandemic, a disease outbreak with a wide geographic range that affects a high proportion of the population. And in Philadelphia, which had a population of about 2 million people at the time, a quarter of the population became infected. And from our count of death certificates, which I'll be talking about in this presentation, at least 17,500 people died from fall 1918 through the following spring. About 14,000 of those died in 6 weeks in the fall, which averages out to more than one death every 5 minutes, if you can imagine that. And among the largest American cities, only Pittsburgh, which only had about a third of the population of Philadelphia, had a higher death rate. So it's worthwhile to study Philadelphia as an epicenter of this disease. Now, the exact origin of the 1918 pandemic influenza virus is still unknown. The natural reservoir of influenza is wild aquatic birds, and the virus mutates frequently and jumps between species. And it can cause epidemics if it mutates into a version that humans have little immunity for. It may have originated in China. Most of the research seems to be pointing that way, but there are also theories that it originated in army camps in England and France. It arose during the final year of World War I, and the movement of millions of troops and civilians during the war helped it to spread quickly to every single continent except Antarctica. In the United States, it first appeared in Camp Funston, an army camp in Kansas in March 1918, and this is a picture from Camp Funston. It was more virulent than seasonal flu. People became ill very quickly from it. And secondary infections, mostly bacterial pneumonia, in combination with the flu, caused most of the deaths. So here's a quotation from a historian talking about that the pandemic was so quick and so fast and so harsh that it was very much a challenge for doctors at the time. They didn't have a chance to try out different remedies or to learn anything about the disease before it was over. And historians have been struggling with it ever since because it's such a condensed event. It's very hard to know how to tackle it. It's not easy to trace the effects of this disease. So how can we grasp an event that was so catastrophic and happened so quickly? And it's been called the forgotten pandemic. What we decided to do was create this project called Spit Spreads Death, the Influenza Pandemic of 1918-19 in Philadelphia. And it has a couple of themes. The primary theme is that the pandemic severely affected Philadelphia, touching every neighborhood and every family. And the secondary theme is that though there's still many unanswered questions about the pandemic, but if we can try to understand what happened here 100 years ago, it can help us deal with the threat of potential future pandemics. We had a number of different goals in this project. We wanted to integrate an artist project with the historical content of the exhibition to express some different aspects of the event. We wanted to show how the disease spread, explore how the city responded to this wartime crisis. We also wanted to memorialize those who died and to connect the pandemic to the present and the future. Now, we named the exhibition after the signs that the city put up on top of wartime fundraising signs. So this was a public health campaign that was very bold and memorable, but ultimately ineffective, as I'll explain later. In preparing for the exhibition, we hired an evaluation firm to survey our audience and find out what they knew about the flu and what they wanted to find out about. Now, we did this in October 2016. If we were asking these same questions now, I'm sure there would be much more awareness of the influenza pandemic. But at the time, about half of the museum visitors had some knowledge and little less than half had little or no knowledge. And they were interested in a lot of different things. We were pleased to find out how intrigued they were. They wanted to find out why it was so deadly, how the virus spread in Philadelphia, how the city dealt with all the deaths, what it was like to live in the city at the time, and what was the possibility of another pandemic in the near future. And we also asked them about how they wanted these stories to be told. They really wanted to see mapping techniques, data visualization, as well as personal stories. So that's why we have those things involved in our project. Here's the exhibition. As you can see, we don't have a very large gallery. So we're trying to fit a very big, complicated story into one room. And we chose some major themes and some important moments, and visitors can follow the story chronologically. And we wanted to ask the question, what happens when a deadly disease strikes a crowded city? How do people cope? What do they feel and fear? And what would you do? For the Artist Project, last September, just a year ago Monday, we held a memorial parade created by the artist group Blast Theory with music by composer David Lang, performed by the choir The Crossing. More than 400 people marched up Broad Street to remember the pandemic's victims and to honor public health workers. And Blast Theory's film of the parade is featured in the exhibition, which opened last October. Now, we knew that since major disease outbreaks happen frequently, sometime over the 4-year run of the show, there would be news headlines that visitors could connect to the events of 100 years ago. But we certainly did not anticipate that the project would become so very relevant so very quickly, and that we would be plunged into another very frightening pandemic with high death rates and an uncertain outcome. One of the reasons the flu was so bad in Philadelphia, and part of the reason we chose a parade as the artist project, is because of this event on September 28th, 1918. This was a massive parade for the Fourth Liberty Loan Drive, and this was held to urge people to buy government bonds to support the U.S. involvement in World War I. And about 200,000 people came to Broad Street to watch the parade. And just about a week before, 600 sailors were reported ill at the Navy Yard, and the first civilian cases appeared in the city. And I'm sorry to report that it appears that the virus had arrived on a Navy ship from Boston. So sailors from Boston brought the disease to Philadelphia. That's okay, we're not blaming you. So despite some early warnings from doctors, the parade went on, and the pressure to meet these fundraising goals was very great. The parade is what we now would call a super spreader event. It was not the only catalyst for the sudden onset of the flu in Philadelphia, but along with other patriotic events and overcrowded housing conditions, people living with poor sanitation, and inadequate and slow government response, it was one of the major factors in Philadelphia's large death toll. As the pandemic got worse, the state and the city did react a bit too late, but they shut down schools, churches, saloons, and theaters, but not all businesses, because factories needed to keep running to make supplies for the war. So taxi drivers, policemen, and car owners drove patients to hospitals. This photo shows a masked policeman taking a flu victim to the hospital. It's rather unusual because masks were not really worn out in public in Philadelphia. They were in other cities where the flu hit later, but not in Philadelphia, which was one of the earlier cities to get hit by the flu. The masks were not widely worn outside of healthcare settings, and in cases like this, where a policeman knew he was coming in contact with a flu victim. So there were volunteers who staffed telephone switchboards and nursed the sick and ladled out soup, and the city put up these signs. Now, the reason for spit spreads death as a message was that they certainly knew, as we know now, that the disease spread by coughing and sneezing, that it was an airborne disease. But they also believed incorrectly that you could catch it by breathing in dust from dried spit on the ground. And as public health messages, you want them to be very clear and you want them to be actionable. So telling people not to spit was a clear, actionable message that seemed like it should have some effect, even though it really didn't. So hospitals filled up within days, and 10 emergency hospitals were established around the city. And many doctors and nurses were serving overseas, so there was a severe shortage of medical personnel. We don't have any interior photos of Philadelphia emergency hospitals, though interior photos of any of these emergency hospitals are very rare. It probably looked like this one, which was set up in Oakland, California, in an auditorium. So here's those anti-spitting message. And this campaign really did not slow or stop the pandemic, but it was an effort on the part of the city to show that they were doing something to help fight the disease. As far as the disease itself goes, the influenza virus inflames the bronchial tubes and lungs, which makes them vulnerable to other infections, especially pneumonia. As I mentioned before, severe bacterial pneumonia combined with flu really was the major cause of deaths in the pandemic. And doctors and scientists didn't know that influenza was a virus until the 30s. There were no vaccines until the 1940s, no antibiotics for pneumonia and other infections. All doctors and nurses could do was to treat symptoms and to provide supportive care. This is an illustration from a 1920 report on the pandemic, and it shows a patient with cyanosis, blue color in the face, caused by fluid in the lungs and lack of oxygen in the blood. This is a human lung specimen not specifically connected to the pandemic, but it shows the effects of pneumonia. The air sacs were filled with fluid and pus and couldn't provide oxygen to the bloodstream. Now, this pandemic is unusual because it severely affected young people, possibly because their strong immune systems overreacted to the virus, or perhaps because immunity from an earlier epidemic in the 1890s left them vulnerable to this new variant of the virus. That's one of those many things that scientists and doctors are still examining, still researching, still trying to figure out. So this medical crisis led to a burial crisis. On an average day in 1918, there were about 50 to 70 deaths in Philadelphia. But hundreds started dying every day at the height of the pandemic in October 1918, and undertakers and cemeteries could not keep up. Caskets and bodies piled up all over the city, and years later, survivors recalled being surrounded by dead bodies as one of the worst parts of the pandemic. It was truly traumatic. Catholic seminarians were enlisted as gravediggers at Holy Cross Cemetery and Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, which were both located outside the city limits. And Catholic sisters from nearby convents cooked meals for the gravediggers. They worked for 5 weeks every day to bury all the caskets in temporary mass graves. You can see in the image on the right, there's a label. These caskets were tagged and were intended to be dug up again and reburied in individual graves after the crisis had passed. So as I mentioned before, the influenza crisis has often been called the forgotten pandemic, and in history books, it's just a footnote to World War I, even though it killed many more people. So many of the 17,500 or more Philadelphians who died in the pandemic were young, like Elena Alessandroni, who was 26 years old. We see her here as a girl. She's standing to the right of her mother, who also perished in the pandemic. Few of the deceased were wealthy or famous, and there is no public memorial to the pandemic victims in Philadelphia. There are very few public memorials to the pandemic anywhere in the world. But we found out as we researched this topic that this was not really a forgotten pandemic. The family members mourned the victims and remembered them and passed down stories through the generation to preserve those memories of the lost. So that's a summary of what happened in Philadelphia. And in terms of a kind of afterwards, the aftermath of the pandemic, there was a lot of study of the pandemic, of the catastrophe, examining it from all angles. And the research really laid the groundwork for the development of influenza vaccines, and it shaped public health responses to later pandemics. So here's a little summary of some of the influenza research and vaccine development with the 3 major pandemics since 1918-19. But turning back to Philadelphia and starting to dig into these statistics, so the virus really did race through the city like a wildfire. You can see this enormous peak in mid-October. So about 500,000 people were infected, about a quarter of the population, and the city was overcrowded with war workers, people who had come to take jobs in industries like shipbuilding, like manufacturing, churning out material for the war effort. About 1 in 28 sick people died, more than 17,500 total, as I mentioned, and 1 death every 5 minutes in 6 weeks in the fall of 1918, that giant peak there. And the worst day was Saturday, October 12th, 1918, when over 850 people died. And this was nearly 10 times greater than the usual death rate. So among the largest American cities, Philadelphia had the highest reported pandemic death rate. So how do we go about finding out more about these deaths? We turned to the death certificates. The data that we gathered from the death certificates became central to how we're telling the story. And we're using the certificates in many different ways. We found out that the Ancestry.com had digitized all of the certificates in cooperation with the Pennsylvania State Archives, and we were able to use them. We got permission from the archives to use them. And we're fortunate in that because there are other states where the death certificates have not been digitized, such as New Jersey. This project would not have been possible without having these certificates available and online. So, and when Ancestry put them online, they just indexed them very briefly. They only put down the very basic information. But we wanted to go back in and get much more information from these certificates. And we decided to transcribe all the certificates from the 6 months of the pandemic to find the flu victims. So that was 30,000 death certificates that we examined to figure out who died of the flu and related causes. This is a very unusual undertaking for a museum to do for an exhibition. So it was a little out there for us to do it, but the results were pretty amazing, we thought. So you can see from these two examples how much information you get from these certificates, that it really is a capsule life story of these people, and they furnish all kinds of information. So the certificates were actually a relatively new phenomenon. The Pennsylvania Department of Health, which itself was a fairly new organization, had begun requiring official certificates for all births and deaths in 1906. And you can see here that doctors needed to file certificates within 24 hours after death or within 12 hours for infectious disease. And there's lots of detailed information about how you write down the occupation of the person, since that was closely connected to their health, as well as details about how to describe the cases of the causes of death. By far the most common death causes for the flu victims are influenza as the first cause and pneumonia as the second cause, although there are a number of other secondary causes as well. So in terms of compiling these, as I said, we got the usage permission from the state archives, started pulling down the scans from Ancestry, and then it was a group of people who entered the information into an Excel spreadsheet. So this was led by historical epidemiologist Nicholas Bonneau, and he gathered together a group of people from retirees to high school students who grappled with the handwriting, with the inconsistent addresses, with the unclear information, with all of the difficulties involved in this kind of transcription effort. It truly was a remarkable effort. So the data that was then gathered over the course of 9 months had many uses. We used it to quantify the impact of the pandemic on the city and the neighborhoods. We used it to identify hard-hit neighborhoods for outreach and for walking tours. We used it to find names of people to memorialize in the art project. In those photos of the parade, you saw people holding signs with names of the dead. Those were from the death data. In the exhibition, we had in memoriam lists in the different sections. We created digital interactives that mapped influenza in the entire city and in neighborhoods. And I'll show you bits from those in a moment. And we also use the data as sources for stories and connections between stories. So many stories in this spreadsheet. And we are creating a comprehensive Spitspreads Death website, which will include the data set. So it will be made public so other people can use it and analyze it. So the main costs for doing something like this are time and labor. There are lots of free or low-cost analysis tools that you can use once you have this data down. And as I said, the data has multiple uses. From my point of view, as a storyteller, it really helps to amend underrepresentation in the historical record. These are the kinds of people who do not often have their stories told. Young people, working class people, people of color, immigrants, the very poor. And what we're finding is that the data and the personal stories really support each other. The data on a large scale helps to contextualize personal stories. The personal stories help to humanize the data. But I don't even see them as being opposed to each other. I really feel that the data are the stories, that each of these death certificates is a capsule history, a capsule life of someone. This is a slide that Nick Bonneau put together that shows some of the many uses that you can put the data to. Once you've got it into the Excel spreadsheet, it can be exported into all of these different kinds of systems for analysis. And here are a few of the preliminary observations that he made from the data. Now, as I said before, the main purpose of gathering this data was for storytelling. It was not for in-depth, rigorous statistical analysis. But that being said, we can pull out a few things. We find that Philadelphia was very much a city of immigrants, first born abroad, first generation, second generation, many people whose origins were unknown as well. We find that in terms of race, the Black population was much smaller in the city at the time. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it turns out that the proportion of deaths was about equivalent to the proportion of Blacks in the overall population. Interestingly, in terms of treatment, about a third of both whites and Blacks died in hospitals or institutions. And that's probably a reflection of that the most serious cases, the ones who are more likely to die, went to the hospitals. But certainly many people died at home as well. And here's just a slice of a massive spreadsheet, just a little screenshot from it. I sorted by the name of hospital, the name of institution where people died. So you can see here's just a handful of the people who died in some of the emergency hospitals that were set up in different buildings around the city. You can see from their last names what a variety of people there were. Here's another slice where I sorted by ward, electoral division. And you can, again, this was a largely Black area. So many of these people would have been African-American, listed here, with their addresses. And we entered the addresses into tools that would generate the geocodes, the latitude and longitude. And it's getting those geocodes exactly right that enable us to visualize the data, to literally map the deaths in the city as the visitors had requested when we did that evaluation. So this is a very simple data visualization. We worked with a interactive designer, interactive mechanics, to create digital interactives that would be more sophisticated than this. And I'll be showing you some aspects of those. So you can see that this data becomes extremely powerful, and you can get some truly remarkable results from it, really seeing where the deaths are concentrated, not surprisingly in the most heavily populated areas of the city. So Philadelphia is really a large, sprawling city. It's 143 square miles total. And Broad Street, which is the north-south spine of the city, runs up and down here, is 13 miles long in the city limits. And this map of the city that was made for public transit planning shows population from the 1920 census, and each of these dots represents 100 people. So you can see the most densely populated areas, this sort of the older central core of the city, South Philadelphia down here, some parts of North Philadelphia, this area less densely populated because this was the commercial district, farther down south, not developed yet. So at the time of the pandemic, the official estimated population was about 1.76 million people. I mentioned there were lots of extra war workers in the city. About 200,000 extra people came to work in war industries. So the city was really packed and really overcrowded. And just for purposes of comparison, population now is about 1.5 million. And here's a sort of population breakdown from the 1920 census. And you can see from this, there's that relatively small Black population. However, it was still one of the largest, if not the largest, Black community in a northern city. And you can see that much of the population was either was born abroad or had one or more parents who were born abroad. So Philadelphia is very much a city of immigrants and a city of migrants, with a very, very small percentage of people from non-European or non-African backgrounds. So what I'd like to do now is switch over to a movie and show you this animation that was created for the exhibition. Here it is in context in the exhibition, in a section called The Pandemic Strikes, a large touchscreen where you can see how it's spread in the city. I'm going to start the movie. It doesn't have a soundtrack. It'll just be me talking over it. So this is the animation that tells the story of how the disease spread in the city. There's the ship from Boston carrying the sailors that came into the Navy Yard. You can see as September goes on, the death toll starts to climb. Here's the Liberty Loan Parade. Still not very many deaths, only about 600 in the city. But then things really start to blow up and the disease spreads all over the city. 500 per day on October 6th, continuing to climb. Deadliest day, the peak of the graph there, 837 deaths. Then after that, it starts to decline because the virus had infected about as many people as it was going to infect. By the end of October, the city lifted the ban on public gatherings. And we did continue the data gathering after this peak, just so we could see what happened into the new year. You can see here the concentration of deaths in high density neighborhoods, and some of those real dense bits are hospitals. So there's kind of a steady drumbeat here with the flu deaths still making up a fairly sizable proportion of overall deaths. And in the new year, with the deaths rising slightly. And then we stopped counting at the end of February. And on the actual interactive, there are filters that you can use to look at different ethnicities and different age groups. And here's a little summary. So the second digital interactive we had in the exhibition that drew on this death data is what we call the Neighborhood Explorer. And here it is in the context of the exhibition. And here, what we can do is, because of all that geolocated data, you can search the city by address, by name. You can find out where a family member died. You can find out if someone died in your house, if you lived in Philadelphia or on your block. And you can really see what the patterns are like. And you can find out also about neighborhoods with photographs of places and people and stories from the pandemic. So my idea in creating this was not just to talk about death in the city, but to talk about life in the city, what life was really like. And we decided to pick 4 different neighborhoods because they tell us about different communities. In the Italian market area, we focused on Italian American immigrants. In Kensington and Port Richmond, up in the north of the city, we're looking at Irish immigrants and also at the mill workers there. That was a big textile center. In the brewery town area, this was largely the German American community working in the brewing industry. And around South Street West is where the Black community was focused. And I'm going to be looking a bit more at that today as just a sort of a case study, an example of how we use this data to explore different neighborhoods, to talk about different communities. And here are those 4 neighborhoods marked on the map. So you can see sort of South Street West, the sort of southern west, south of City Hall. Now, part of the reason this area is so interesting is because it was studied in 1899 by W.E.B. Du Bois, pioneering sociologist, and published as a famous work called The Philadelphia Negro, a Social Study. And we could have a whole nother presentation on Du Bois's work and what he found out. But he and his collaborators went house to house and found out the socioeconomic status of all of the African Americans living in this one ward, in this electoral district. And the study is important for many reasons, and partly because it is one of the first studies that really points out what we would now call systematic problems that were facing the Black community: discrimination in housing, discrimination in jobs, difficulty accessing education, all of those large systemic problems that were causing difficulties for the Black community. So about 20 years later, a couple decades later, that area was still largely African American, small but growing because of the influx of people escaping the Jim Crow South, coming north to northern cities to find jobs and to find, they hoped, better conditions. So you can see from this area was about 40% Black at the time, and then with proportionately smaller numbers of immigrants and people who were born here. The impact in this neighborhood was pretty strong. About 1,200 people died in this neighborhood for a death rate of about 1.28%. And this is significantly higher than the estimated death rate for the city as a whole. What I'm showing you here is a screenshot from part of the interactive where you can see the deaths, how they are spread around, scattered, but there's one every few blocks, several on some blocks. So who were these people? There was a pretty big variety even within this small Black community. There were the old Philadelphians, and these were the folks who had been established in Philadelphia for a long time, and some of them had, with great struggle, achieved higher levels of education and were working as professionals, where they were business owners, doctors, lawyers, teachers, professors. So there was a small middle class, very, very tiny upper class in the Black community who were the leaders of this community. But there were also growing numbers of people who were very poor, who were working as laborers, working as cleaners, working as janitors, doing all kinds of very hard work because they were restricted from other kinds of jobs, until it was starting to change very gradually that Blacks were being allowed to do factory work, to be machine operatives in factories because of the high demand for war workers. But most of them were shut out from that kind of skilled labor. And they were relegated to very, very kinds of hard labor. And the death data really bear this out. Here's a little slice of people sorted by race. So these were all people who were described as Black or Negro or colored on the death certificates. And you can see from this list of occupations, the kinds of jobs that they had: laborer, hod carrier, laborer, a policeman, unusual, housekeeper, maid, housekeeper, laborer, teamster, domestic. The women were, if they were not at home with the children as housewives, were doing domestic work for other people. Many of the men were laborers, stevedores, janitors, those kinds of positions. And you can see their origin. Many of them were born in the South, although some of them were born in Philadelphia or in other places in the North. What about the living conditions for these people? Well, by 1918, Philadelphia was a modern city. It had electricity, it had running water, there were skyscrapers and elevators and telephone lines, but those were for middle class and upper class people. A lot of middle class people who were living in modernized homes or in apartment buildings, they had electricity, they had central heat, they had indoor plumbing. But the small row houses in older working class neighborhoods that housed the majority of people did not have those amenities, or it was very rare. So if you were lucky, your house had its own cold water tap in the backyard shed and its own outhouse with a working toilet that was connected to a sewer line. But if you were less fortunate, you shared a water tap and outhouses with several other families, and your outhouse may not have even been connected to a sewer. It may have been sitting above a privy pit. So gas was for lighting only, and heat was from coal or wood stoves. So you can get a sense of the conditions that people were living in, and this lack of sanitation combined with overcrowding really did contribute to high rates of infection and death in working class and immigrant neighborhoods like the 7th Ward during the pandemic. And in a row house like this, where today you might have a family of 3, maybe you would have 4 people living in the house, there would have been multiple families living in many of these homes at the time. In terms of medical care, most medical care at the time was provided by hospitals or by doctors who made house calls, and people paid cash for medical care, or they went to free clinics known as dispensaries, or to hospitals that provided for charity cases. This is Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital, located in the 7th Ward. It was founded by Dr. Nathan Moselle, who was one of those old Philadelphians, the first Black graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And he founded the hospital to care for members of the Black community and also to provide opportunities, training opportunities, for Black doctors and nurses who were not allowed elsewhere. So this was a state-of-the-art hospital at the time. When it was built in 1909, it had operating rooms, an x-ray room, a pathology lab, and it did operate on a cash basis, but it didn't refuse poor patients. And in fact, during the pandemic, Dr. Moselle said that anyone who was sick could come and be taken care of. And he even opened an emergency hospital in a school of several blocks away. So our records show that 35 people died of Douglas of flu and related infections, and 4 more in the emergency annex, 39 people altogether. And of those 39, 32 were Black, 6 were white, and interestingly, there was 1 Asian, a Chinese laundryman. One of the dead was this young girl, Blanche Wilson, who was only 11 years old when she died at Douglas Hospital of lobar pneumonia. Her sister, Louisa Wilson, 7 years old, had died just 10 days before at another hospital, Frankfurt Hospital, which was near where their parents lived. We happen to know a little bit more about these 2 girls because their obituary was printed in the Philadelphia Tribune, the city's Black newspaper, on October 26, 1918, on the social page, where there were several other people who also died of the flu. So just imagine what it was like for these parents to have their 2 daughters die in 2 separate hospitals 10 days apart. We don't know why the Wilsons left their neighborhood of Frankfurt, which is about 8 miles north, up in northern Philadelphia, why they brought their second daughter down to Douglas Hospital, maybe because the Frankfurt Hospital was full, or maybe because they thought she would receive better care at a Black-run hospital. We don't know, but it must have been a very compelling reason to bring a sick little girl 8 miles through a city paralyzed by the flu. So these are the kinds of stories that arise in the death certificates once you start looking at the neighborhoods, the neighborhood context, the community context for these stories. So, and the Wilsons did have jobs that required hard physical labor. William Wilson, the father, was born in North Carolina. He was a laborer at the Navy Yard, and Emma did laundry at home. So again, those very hard labor kind of jobs. So these kinds of stories come up over and over in the records of the pandemic. People lost children, siblings, and parents. The loss of a breadwinner, father or mother, often led to deepening of poverty for people who were already living on the edge. And also, if the mother died, who was the family caretaker, or also older aunts or sisters or other female relatives, that put pressure on fathers and other remaining family members. And for the people who survived the illness, there could be a really prolonged recovery time leading to a loss of income. And the trauma from witnessing so much illness and death really stayed with people long after the pandemic passed. Now, just as a note, it was interesting that the Tribune tended to downplay the effects of the pandemic on the Black community. There are almost no general news stories about the flu, though it did run obituaries like this, and it noted in its neighborhood social columns if people were recovering from the illness. So there was sort of this muted coverage may reflect the belief that African Americans were not as susceptible to the flu as the white population. And this was a belief that comes up in the papers where sometimes some of the articles will say, well, this is a problem for the white population, not so much for us. However, our death certificate statistics do show, as I showed before, that about 7.9% of the flu victims were Black, a little higher than their proportion in the population, 7.4%. So they did not have any special resistance to the disease. In general, poorer people living in overcrowded substandard housing without indoor plumbing, whatever their race, were generally the ones who suffered most during the pandemic. And here's just to show you some of these houses as they look today. And here's a detail from a fire insurance map where you can see how uniform the houses are with their little sheds out back. And on this block, which was fairly typical of the neighborhood at the time, 41 houses, 124 people, 119 of those are Black, 5 are white. Most of the people here rented. Many of them came from southern states. They all had jobs: cook, housekeeper, butler, chauffeur, waiters, waitresses, maid, janitor, locomotive porter, messenger, laborer, hairdressers, washerwomen, laundresses. We know of one death on this block. This was at 1826 Webster. This was Gladys Brown, 15-year-old daughter of Eliza Brown. And we don't know much about her. She was a widow at the time. And after the death of her daughter, she becomes difficult to trace, and she may have been working, the mother may have been working as a servant after her daughter passed away. And you notice that Gladys passed away at Douglas Hospital. Another interesting point about this street, this block, is this is the block where the singer Marian Anderson was born. She was one of the most celebrated singers of the 20th century, and she was a civil rights and humanitarian activist. And she toured worldwide, singing classical songs, opera, traditional American songs, and spirituals. She's probably best known today for performing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on Easter Sunday in 1939. After she was blocked from singing to an integrated audience in a concert hall, and she passed away in 1993. This photo shows her when she was 13 in 1910, and her father is not in the picture because he had passed away in an accident, a workplace accident. He was a coal and ice dealer in the Reading Terminal Market. So the family really did struggle after the death of the father. The mother had qualified as a teacher in Virginia, her native Virginia, but did not requalify in Philadelphia, so she ended up doing domestic work like cleaning and laundry. Marian began singing at age 6 in the choir of the nearby Union Baptist Church, and eventually the choir pitched in to give her singing lessons, recognizing her talent, and she gradually built a career from that. And she apparently, luckily, escaped the flu. She was 21 years old that year, taking voice classes and doing some paid performances. So there's a little glimpse of someone famous who had very humble beginnings in this tiny row house in Philadelphia. So that's a kind of whirlwind tour through Philadelphia, through the death data, through some many stories, and I have many more I could tell, but I'm sure you don't want to be here all day. I wanted to close with this pretty remarkable Facebook post that a member of the Mütter Museum posted in April, when things were pretty bad here in Philadelphia, although they never got as bad as they did in New York, where she had seen this photo from 1918 from a public health bulletin of a nurse in a gauze mask, and posted a picture of herself in all of her PPE when she was working in an emergency room, and talking about how she can really identify with this nurse, having lived through this pandemic. So what we want to do with a project like this is really create empathy. We want people to think about what it was like being in a situation like this 100 years ago. And hopefully that can help us think about what we're going through today and what others might go through in years to come. So I want to close with a few plugs. The Mütter Museum, follow them on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you'd like to support the Mütter, donations are always welcome. And I certainly want to thank the generous funders who made this very ambitious, very complex, multi-part project possible. Here they are listed here. And the valiant transcribers, the strugglers with terrible doctor's handwriting, who are listed here, led by Nicholas Bonneau. So visit the Mütter Museum for more on Spitz-Fred's death. There's a virtual exhibition tour that's led by the museum curator, Anna Doty, and versions of the digital interactives so you can explore those yourself and follow the Mütter on social media. And if you have questions for me, that I don't get to today, you can reach me at this email address. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. I'm sure that I join everyone else in being really amazed by the scope and both the breadth and the depth of this highly interdisciplinary project. It was really quite remarkable. So many things happening here, and I think it gives us a really remarkable model of interdisciplinary work that we don't often see. You know, people from art history thinking about narrative, as you are. That's not necessarily an art history thing, but your particular interest in telling the story as a museum professional, translating that, the epidemiology and the public health aspects. We do have a few questions coming in, and I hope that there'll be more. And there's such a variety of people here, and we have questions from librarians and others. So to start with one from a librarian, what information would you like to have seen, right, that actually you couldn't get from the death certificates, from what was available?
Well, that is a great question, and I'll sort of back up a bit on that question. And one of the challenges for creating an exhibition on this topic is that there are not that many artifacts. And
right.
There are just not that many things that were left behind. We managed to find a few family belongings that had belonged to victims of the pandemic, and we put those on exhibition, but there's no way we could fill up an entire gallery with objects the way you can with something like the Civil War or even World War I itself. So what we did put out calls to the general public for family stories, and we've gotten so many responses of people sending in their family stories from the Philadelphia region that we're creating a digital scrapbook of those stories that is going to be posted later this year. So there'll be yet another sort of layer of storytelling. Now, ideally, a sort of a gold standard for a museum exhibition is a beautiful artifact and you know the person who owned it, you have a story connected with it, you have a photograph of that person, you have that person's diary. It's very rare that all of those things come together at once. So oftentimes you have to take a fragment and sort of extrapolate out from that. And we did that with some of the photographs that we have, where we have photographs that obviously show someone who lived at the time, but we don't know much about them. But we tried to kind of contextualize those.
Well, that's remarkable. I wonder nowadays some institutions are collecting things on the go. I know I'm thinking about the Victoria and Albert Museum. They have a room where they show the things that they're collecting like this month, and that they'll weed out of the collection if they turn out not to be important. But they're collecting just in case. Was anybody, doing that kind of thing, do you think, at the time?
No, at the time, people were really focused largely on survival. And I should mention that we do have some oral histories that were collected in the 1980s of people who were young at the time of the flu and were elderly in the 80s. And we have excerpts from those in the exhibition in the digital interactive. So we do have some firsthand accounts, but we don't have a journal of the plague year, for instance.
Right.
There are some a few pieces of literature. Pale Horse, Pale Rider is the most famous one, the novella, but not that much cultural production. No grand operas, very few artworks. It was very much a sort of a privately commemorated event. It didn't leave that large of a cultural footprint. Now, I think what we're living through now is going to leave a larger cultural footprint because of the incessant documentation of every minute of every day on social media and so forth.
Wow. Okay. We have a question from a physician assistant who asks, was there a theory as to why more people didn't become ill? You've shown us some very close living quarters. Were people quarantining? Was school held or not? This person expresses a great appreciation both for your talk and for the museum. I could keep listening for hours, and I appreciate that as well. But I wonder, do you have a sense, were people social distancing, aside from, keeping people from spitting? What other things kept the disease from spreading even more than it did?
Okay. Well, yes, it really depends on where you are. Different areas, different states had different regulations, different cities had different regulations. So the state had some layers of closures, saloons, theaters. I'd have to look up and remember who ordered the schools to close, who ordered the theaters to close. The state did leave it up to individual municipalities to impose their own closures. It was not a kind of lockdown like we experienced here. It really was more like crowd bans than lockdown or quarantine. So large gatherings were prohibited or discouraged. People, however, were still crowding onto streetcars and going to work, even if schools were closed. So there were definitely opportunities for people to come into contact with each other. And apart from the no spitting, there were health rules like, use a handkerchief when you cough or sneeze, boil your handkerchief, sterilize your handkerchief. Imagine trying to do that if you don't have running water. So a lot of these, have a healthy atmosphere with fresh air and eat fresh food and get plenty of rest. So all the kind of advice that is very difficult if you're working 12 hours a day doing very difficult kinds of jobs. So there was that kind of advice, and people did try to stay away from each other if they were sick, but it was very, very hard to isolate in these small row houses when you're all crowded in together. That being said, there were some institutions that had quarantines. Bryn Mawr College, for instance, had a quarantine where students were not allowed off campus. And they ended up, even though they had a number of students fell ill, nobody died. Eastern State Penitentiary, the prison, quarantined. If you're already a place that has walls and gates and locks, it's a lot easier to quarantine. The University of Pennsylvania had sort of partial quarantine. Girard College, which was a boarding school, had to quarantine. So there were sort of spotty quarantines that had varying degrees of effectiveness.
Really interesting stuff. And the fact that it was, directed, as we're doing some of that here obviously now, by individual institutions, right? It's a lot of independence rather than a unified policy. Well, we have a question about how this type of work might be done, or what do you think about the possibility of doing this type of work in a kind of crowdsourced way? Like, you had a team working on the death certificates and doing the categorization, so this is somebody with a variety of backgrounds in sociology and pharmacy. People can guess who it is, who asks, could this sort of work be undertaken maybe on a smaller scale as a crowdsourced project where you might get tell students, hey, go for it, help us code this huge stack of things, we've digitized them, and go in, and if you can do one, if you can do 5, if you can do 50, it'll go into the database, and then everyone will contribute. Is this something that can be done that way, or do you need to train all the coders and make sure they're working from the same code book, and et cetera?
Well, there certainly are lots of crowdsourced type projects that do put the projects out there for the general public to do. So there's transcription projects, there are astronomy projects, there's many, dozens, hundreds, probably thousands of projects that use this kind of crowdsourcing data, and we did discuss that. However, it was because of the time limitations that we had, it ended up being more efficient to just gather a team together and to do it that way.
Right. Right. That makes sense. And I know the qualitative coding can be really hard. I think if there are certain aspects of it could probably, maybe the literal mapping or the more objective things could probably be coded, by just about anyone, right? If it's clear, but then other things might need to be looked at differently.
Yeah, it's something that the people who were doing more of it found that it got easier as you got along. It's a little hard to just kind of pick up and do a few, just because
Right.
you have to dig into that handwriting and you have to decipher the addresses, and sometimes the streets have changed and there's all kinds of things to figure out.
Okay, so there's a kind of diminishing marginal effort. The next one takes a little bit less effort once you get used to it. Mm-hmm. We have a question from a student, and then I think after this one, unless people are typing more in, the numbers have gone down a bit as people have other commitments. I could maybe allow people to unmute. I know Jen Ho has a question as well, and we can have a more open discussion. I hope that we get to discuss more about the storytelling and the narrative and what that means on a public sort of broad basis and the relationship between the big story and the little story. But for a student who just wants to hear a little more about what we can learn, from a humanities or health humanities perspective, there may not be a term that you've used a lot, so maybe you may not have a view of health humanities per se.
Well, that's actually what the Mütter has been doing in its latest exhibition, is specifically taking a health humanities approach. So
great. I mean, health humanities is so broad, and not everybody who's doing it knows that she's doing it. But this question, can you say more about what we learned from these stories and this picture from the previous century about what we're experiencing now? You said some of that, but I wonder if you could spell that out for the student.
Well, that's something that when I got called upon to be a kind of Insta pundit earlier in the spring, as I and other members of the team were suddenly in much demand from the media to opine upon the lessons of 1918 applied to today. And, I have a hard time, because history is so contingent and is always changing. I have a hard time drawing hard and fast lessons, but there are some things that I've been saying is that the importance of transparency in a public health crisis really can't be overstated. If Philadelphia had said, oh my gosh, we have a problem, there's a disease in the city, we really can't hold this big fundraising parade, and this is what you have to do to help stop this thing from spreading. These are the actions you need to take. Even given their limited knowledge at the time, they could have helped to avoid this problem. And that transparency needs to happen on all levels: federal, state, local. Part of the problem in 1918 is that because of purported morale boosting for the war, President Woodrow Wilson never made a public statement about the flu. There was some guidance, there were circulars put out, some advice to people, but there was never leadership from the top saying, we were in a war, but there's this other terrible crisis, this is how we have to tackle it.
Wow.
So I would say transparency is the number one thing. Empathy is another one. Just, you don't know what people are going through, and people have we have all been affected by this current pandemic in different ways. Some more have been touched more closely by it than others, but we all need to have empathy for each other as we're struggling through this.
All right, thank you. We're at about half. Well, we've lost a few. There's still a lot of people here. I'm going to take a bit of a risk and allow everyone to unmute themselves. If it gets a little bit crazy, then I'll ask people to raise hands to be recognized. And if it does get crazy, I apologize. This is our first webinar for Health Humanities. And so I'm going to click there. So now if you have a question, politely You may test by unmuting yourself, and I will recognize Dr. Ho first and go from there.
Great. Jane, that was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
I echo Ken's sentiment. I could listen to that all day. It was like
Well, that wasn't even
amazing
me. That was
podcast.
somebody else.
NPR did.
Okay, well, this was just,
forever.
this is just the first of a 10-lecture series. Didn't you know?
Amazing. And I don't know if you noticed, I brought some MCPHS students to the Mütter Museum years ago for a behind-the-scene tour of the museum. And the kids were just blown away. Everything from seeing slices of Einstein's brain to various masks that were created for patients with latent syphilis. It was an incredible, incredible trip. One of my most favorite places in the world by far. I want to ask you a question. I would assume that with any global crisis, that there would be at least immediate reaction after the crisis has subsided. So at the end of World War I, you see the founding of the League of Nations as a way to ensure that something like that never happens again. And in the end of World War II, you also see alliances being formed as a way to check any sort of aggressive power. But yet, when it comes to the influenza of 1918 and 1919, I was really surprised to find that there isn't a lot of, how should I say, political and social reaction to the pandemic. And some of these people were, some of the people who were directly influenced by the pandemic were leading intellectuals, politicians, and scientists, and so on. The pandemic impacted them personally. Yet you don't really see any of a strong legacy of reaction towards the pandemic. What do you think of that?
Oh, that is a very big question, but there certainly are some threads I can pull out of that. The part of it is just the way that sort of history was perceived in the early 20th century. History was really seen as a political movement. History was about politics, it was about economics. It was not about diseases, and disease outbreaks were considered almost to be sort of, acts of nature. Things that were in a way sort of outside of history almost. So it wasn't something that really got considered to be part of history. It ended up becoming this, like I said, private individual mourning thing. In terms of responses to it, you would think that you would have a kind of, in response to something that killed so many people so quickly, that you would have an equivalent of a kind of a League of Nations, an emergency league formed to create public health initiatives so this would not happen again. There was no large scale initiative like that, but instead there were sort of groundwork was laid for responses to future disease outbreaks. Things like certainly the hunt for the vaccine, which is not something I touched on very much in this presentation, was panicked. Every researcher, every doctor, everyone who had some knowledge of infectious diseases was in the laboratory trying desperately to find what was the disease-causing agent and how could they stop it. They identified a bacillus, which was a bacterium that they thought was the cause of the flu, and developed vaccines against that, but that didn't work. So they were definitely frantically trying to find something and that could stop this, but they were not able to. But all of that research then continued, and over the next decades ended up with the identification of the virus and then the development of the vaccine, which was first given to soldiers in World War II and then given to the general population. So it was more sort of stepwise and incremental and stopping and starting, those kinds of things. You could argue, I suppose, that our system of kind of global surveillance of disease with the WHO and other entities watching for CDC, watching for influenza, watching for other infectious diseases, had some roots in this event, but it's not something you can point a direct finger to say this caused this. It's all very, very incremental and gradual.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So who else has a question? I don't see anything else in the chat. Zoom does not charge extra for more minutes. And so you know, you're all free to go, obviously. But I have more things I want to talk about, but I get to do that if I have Jane's phone number. I can just call her up. So, but now this is your opportunity. So unmute yourself, or let me know that you'd like to be unmuted, and we can recognize some more people. We'd love to hear from students. Jen usually chairs these things and always insists on calling on students first. If I were a student, I'd be thinking, hey, how do I get to be more like Jane? How do I get to do that? Right? What do I have to study, and who do I need to interview with to get involved in this kind of really, really interesting work? Because it's very slow, right? She talked about doing the needs assessment or the background knowledge in 2016, opening up the exhibit in 2019. That's something to keep in mind. Sometimes we see projects that are equally ambitious, but you know, people want to do all these things and get it done for their senior project, you know, in 4 months. And we learn from this kind of presentation how in-depth and how long and detailed and laborious but worthwhile it is.
Well, it's true, and we were very fortunate to have a very generous funders. The Pew Center for Arts and Heritage funded a year a discovery grant, which enabled us to go hunting for the kind of artist that we wanted to have the artist project, and then they funded an implementation grant, which funded Blast Theory's work and funded the parade and the composer and the choir and all of that amazing outreach stuff that we did to neighborhoods and to community health groups. So it really was a citywide parade, a citywide celebration commemoration.
Wild. I see Caroline Farkas unmuted herself.
Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It was so interesting. I have also been to the Mütter and like have a love, nausea, fascination with all of the things in jars. I think that the work of medical history museums is just so important, and I very much appreciated the talk today.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's funny. I kind of fell into working for the Mütter Museum, doing a little editing project, in fact, and then that grew into some other projects. And I also was one of the guest co-curator of the previous long-term exhibition in that same gallery, which was on Civil War medicine, called Broken Bodies, Suffering Spirits.
I saw that one.
You saw that? Yep,
yeah.
That was me and a whole bunch of other people. So that exhibition was really the first sort of major medical humanities effort by the museum. So it was quite successful, and we're hoping to do, you know, a wonderful series of exhibitions like this that really delve into these events and tell the medical story as a human story.
Right. Well, who else? You know, you all know I can go on and on with questions and comments, but who else has something they'd like to add now? Oh, we have another student question. That's one thing that's so nice about Zoom. People can ask questions without speaking up if they're not comfortable. And okay, now this is an interesting question. This student asks, if or given that the Spanish flu gets its name because of its presumed origins. Now, you said it was really because it was written about so much in Spain, not necessarily that it originated there. But that's a name that's attached to a place. And so this student asks, well, you know, why are we rejecting attaching the virus that we're dealing with now to China? So I'm not sure that you can say a lot about that, but that is a difference, right? That we were quite comfortable. Maybe we just didn't think about it. We call it the Spanish flu, and we don't think that we're being mean to Spain, right?
Well, another interesting point is that there was some talk particularly at the beginning of the flu, that, oh my gosh, this is germ warfare unleashed on us by the Germans. And that was never a majority opinion, but it was something that some people said was a possibility. Their medical knowledge had been advanced far enough that they knew it wasn't the work of demons, for heaven's sakes. This was the 20th century. And it quickly became apparent that this was not something that any one country or any one rogue laboratory could have unleashed, that it really was a natural, terrible, but a natural phenomenon. So I guess you could argue, what good does it do to blame one place as the origin of something? If we all have to deal with it, does it really help to, I don't know. I would, yes, it's not quite fair to scapegoat Spain, and it's not quite fair to scapegoat China either.
Right, and it's just that we have that we're, and a lot of things become more sensitive, and our use of language has been, has changed, and maybe that's one of the things we used to say a lot of things about a lot of places and people that we no longer do.
Exactly. I think we're much more aware of that sort of language, that kind of sensitivity.
Okay, well, you made a choice to put this landscape behind you, and I have a question about that. What is, did you choose that for a particular reason, or it's lovely, but is there a significance with respect to the talk today?
Well, I considered putting a sort of a flu background, but I thought that would be too depressing. It's not even a 1918 painting. It's about I think it's from the 1940s by a Philadelphia artist whose name I can't recall right now. I just like it. It's a pretty painting. It's nice to have this as my background.
Good. It looks like you got your head in the clouds. I was, oh, and yes, you have a thumbs up for from one of my colleagues for the background. Anyone can speak up, but I notice that there's a difference since we were focusing on racial groups, or you were focusing on racial groups. It's quite remarkable that you found that there was a proportional effect on the Black population. You didn't comment on the name that they used for that population, which we wouldn't use now, but which was neutral at the time.
Yes.
But now, both the percentage of populations, the sort of Black, the percentage of Black people in the population, and the percentage of Black people who died in hospitals was about the same.
Yes.
And maybe more, but was it the same? Was it proportional? The at-home deaths, were they proportional as well, or do you not know?
Well, this is partly why we want to put this data set out for the public, so people can delve into it and get all kinds of information from it. We really only scratched the surface for the exhibition. There's so much more here. Every time I go and open up the spreadsheet, I find another fascinating story. So in terms of, we're trying to see what kind of conclusions we could draw about health disparities. And there weren't a lot of really specific things we could come up with. We were expecting actually a higher death rate for the Black population than we did. But what we did find is that, as I said, that particular neighborhood, which was a mixed neighborhood, a lot of high Black population in the neighborhood, but many other people as well living in the neighborhood did have a higher proportional death rate. And the neighborhoods we looked at, which were more overcrowded, which were more poor, which had a higher proportion of immigrants and migrants, those were the neighborhoods with the higher death rates. So my sense is, and this is not hard or fast, and someone would really have to delve into the numbers and do a more detailed analysis and cross-correlate the death records with the census records in a very detailed kind of way. That is not something that we were able to do with this project, but that has been done in Chicago. So, and I could look up the link and send that to you if anyone was interested, where they did take the death stats and the census records and tried to find out what the socioeconomic factors were. And the census records do not list income level, but they do list literacy, which you can use as a proxy for socioeconomic level. And they did find in Chicago that higher infection rates, higher death rates were correlated with low literacy. So that confirms what we have been preliminarily seeing in our records, is that the people who were poorer, who had worse living conditions, who had harder jobs, were the ones who, the virus doesn't care who it infects, but the people who had poor living conditions were the ones who were more likely to get sick and be sicker and die.
Right. Yeah, I was interested in the idea that African Americans, Black people might be, traditionally have had worse experiences in hospitals, and therefore might not show up. And there's a whole history of their Black people being, having to go through the back door, sort of literally, and then being, used as teaching subjects, et cetera, instead of being treated as regular patients, so that they may just have stayed away, right? Which is part of the whole reason why there's a history of home births and things like that, because they really couldn't and couldn't trust the white hospitals. So it would be interesting. Now, and Jane's just described, I know we've down to 32 people from a high of 108, and that's totally great and fine and wonderful. But
the diehards.
yeah, we're exactly we're hardcore here. But you just described some potential research that our public health graduate students and our faculty might be interested in exploring. Either you said, hey, somebody else could come, and so that with your database or others, right? There are all these questions that somebody can look into.
Well, and Boston was quite hard hit, as well as some other communities. Fall River, Lowell, Providence, all had very high death rates because these were industrial centers with high immigrant populations, overcrowded housing, all of those same factors. So there's certainly lots to be done. I don't know what specifically has been done about Boston, but Boston was hard hit during the pandemic.
Nice. Wow. What else do people want to talk about? I know some people who are still here are interested in narrative, I think, and also in health humanities. You said that, and we should let you go soon, but you said that there's a movement at the Mütter toward integrating health humanities or a health humanities approach compared to what they were doing before. Did they have a way of describing what that means? I think we're all deep into health humanities, but we don't always know exactly what it means.
Well, what the Mütter's been doing, and they've been doing it for quite a number of years now, is the shift away from, as collections of pathological anatomical specimens became, less a central part of medical education. In order to retain an audience, they had to kind of shift, and to open to the general public, you have to tell the stories in a different way. It's not just enough to put the Latin name of the disease on a label, right, on a jar with some blobby thing in it. You really have to tell the whole story. So they have definitely been moving in this direction for a number of decades, but they've only fairly recently, within the past decade or so, put the term medical humanities as how
Right.
they've been talking about it. And it really is about telling that human side of medicine and bringing in these other disciplines in order to illuminate those objects, those specimens in the collection. And not just the specimens, the instruments, all kinds of other things, the amazing library collections.
Right.
So all of these things come into play. And bringing in artists has been a big part of that. They have they have an art gallery where artists who do work on medical topics are regularly shown. And integrating artist projects with these exhibitions has also been important.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, good. This wasn't intended to be an interview show. And so I really encourage anyone who's here to have another question. Good. What other reasons, other than boosting positive morale, do you think were behind leaving not covering the flu in the media?
That is a very good question. Morale was part of it. There were actually federal laws against criticizing the government. There was a law against sedition. I can't remember the names offhand of the laws, but there were two major federal laws that basically made it a crime to speak against the government, to speak against the government's involvement in the war. And those also affected the press very strongly. So it was the sort of thing where if you said something wrong, you could get in trouble, because there were actually vigilantes who were going around listening to people, and you could get in trouble if you said something against the government. So that, by extension, meant that criticism of even of the city government for mishandling the flu was quite muted and very not very public, not very frequent. So there were all of these factors that led into this disease not being which is not to say that there was newspaper coverage of it. One of my favorite headlines is something like, "Cases mount but death rate declines." So trying to put a kind of a positive spin on this bad news. And when you look at the newspapers at the time, the war news, the first 5 or 6 pages of the newspaper is always the war news. And then the flu news is on the inside. It's like the local news, the smaller stories.
Wow. Yeah. So we're watching the effect of this kind of law in Hong Kong, but we forget that that we had that here at some period.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. What else is on people's mind?
Can I jump in real quick and ask a quick question?
Sure.
I'm actually working on a paper for a presentation next week on the relationship between political system and effectiveness of governments in response to a pandemic or global health crisis. So I wonder, what do you think? Do you think it would have made a difference if the United States acted more coherently from a federal point of view in tackling the pandemic? Because as far as I understand, the 1918-1919 pandemic was really tackled from a fairly piecemeal point of view down to cities, if not neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Would it help if the federal government, assuming that executive limitations are ignored, come in and use a iron fist to actually impose certain measures?
Well, that's speculative, but I imagine that it would have helped, because they already had this sort of propaganda machine in place, pumping out these patriotic messages, things like don't waste food, volunteer, buy war bonds, all of those things. So if they had turned that messaging towards really focusing on clamping down on the flu, I imagine it certainly would have helped. So it's hard to know, and I think someone who is a bit more versed in the sort of the details of the politics of the time could answer that in a bit more detail. But my sense is that yes, certainly a strong response from the top would have helped.
Well, good. Anything else that people want to raise? I feel it may be appropriate for you to have an official close so that people don't feel. I think I feel this sometimes. I go, I don't want to go because I'm gonna miss a nugget of truth. And yet, some people may be, hanging on, thinking, well, when is it going to be the official close?
Oh, we're already over time.
Getting hungry. Yeah, we're way over time. It's so fantastic.
Oh, this is wonderful. I could go on. I could go on and on. There's so much more that I wasn't able to put in, but I hope I gave you a little taste of the exhibition. So you can definitely visit the exhibition website and look at the interactives, and keep an eye out for the scrapbook of the family stories that's going to come along soon. So.
Wow, fantastic! And we'll have this recorded and posted probably on the center website, the Center for Health Humanities website, and also in the news. We have someone who writes, we hope that Jane returns for another talk sometime soon. So maybe this 10 lecture series is a thing.
Well, thank you. That's very nice.
So I think when it gets written up, we'll may be able to put a link to the exhibit site of the museum on the museum site so that people can go there. There are also other. If you search, you'll find that Jane has commented in various forms of media on this about bedpans and other things, so that you could find out some other details about the working and creation of this exhibit. So good, excellent. So getting some more praise in the chat, which is wonderful. And so thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining us, and for the Remainers for being so hardcore as to hang out for almost 2 hours with us. And we're going to have another talk in November. It will not be like this. It's going to be different. It's going to be about psychology and behavioral science, particularly autism, and we're going to have one of the most prominent autism advocates speaking basically about why he doesn't want anyone to make him normal and what's wrong with that, which is going to be really great. He's famously autistic himself, and he's going to be speaking about giving a critique of behavioral intervention. So very different approach. And yeah, good. And we have some fans of that as well. And so it's been wonderful to just to get together with everyone and bring people together. And thank you, Jane, so much for that. Among other things, you're modeling what interdisciplinary research looks like, and it's fantastic. Anybody else want to chime in?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for all your questions and comments.
All right, you're getting some applause, some virtual applause. Good. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
We'll have this up, and we'll see you. We'll see you all next time, and or hopefully before. So I'll send a note out to everyone, and if you'd like to receive information about we don't quite have an official list yet, but if you'd like to receive information about our future talks and you're not an MCPHS faculty member, let us know, and we'll try to keep in touch. All right. Bye. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks.
See everybody soon. Bye.
Bye.
I'm going to end now.